to Generals of World War II, The Art of Command. I'm your host, John Viscardo, and with me today is Nathaniel Marshell from the University of North Texas. Hello, Nathaniel.
Oh, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, my pleasure, my pleasure. We're going to discuss one of the more famous generals today, General Patton. But before we get to that, I want to make sure that all of our listeners check out our other podcast, Generals in Napoleon. That's the original podcast, and this is a new version on World War II. And I thought we'd start off with arguably the most famous general of World War II. Others might argue MacArthur or Eisenhower. But Nathaniel, what made General Patton so unique?
Well, I think the question really comes down to Patton's image, right? So he creates this carefully cultivated image that we're all familiar with of this officer with his varnished helmet, his pair of ivory-handled revolvers, his riding chaps or his riding boots. Pardon
Yep.
me. You combine that with his proximity to other big names in World War II, like Bradley, Eisenhower, Hapgay, and his proximity to the big events of World War II for the United States, right? So he's present during Operation Torch. He takes over after the disaster at the Castorene Pass. He leads 7th Army in Sicily, and ultimately his biggest accomplishment of swinging 3rd Army north to relieve the defenders of Bastogne. All of these combine to make a really compelling character. And then once you have this compelling character, we have to keep in mind that Patton doesn't survive very long after the war. So he's not able to dispute any of these sort of mythological claims or these fantastical elements of his story. He's not able to say, no, that didn't happen. It happened this way. And that allows lots of people after the war to use Patton's image for their own goals, whether that's good, making Patton out to be a good character, bad character, or something in between.
Yeah, I think you make a great point there. There's no memoir. General Bradley has his memoir in 1951. But with Patton, we're kind of left with the movie, which you and I were talking about before, is fantastic. But we don't have his actual, here's my published memoir of everything that happened to me. He kind of almost like Admiral Nelson, like he dies at his greatest moment right at the end of World War II.
Yes, exactly. And we have his pseudo autobiography, but that's also plagued with problems too, because ultimately it wasn't him signing off on the finished product.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot to him. So hopefully we'll kind of weed through that here in the next few minutes. Let's start with his early life and influences. George S. Patton was born in November 1885 in San Gabriel, California. How did Patton's upbringing in a family steeped in military tradition shape his identity as a soldier from an early age?
Well, it's important to remember that his family is originally from Virginia. So Patton's his grandfather, George S. Patton, was killed during the Civil War. He fought for the Virginia Army, which was part of the Confederacy. He had a great uncle that was also killed during the Civil War. After the Civil War, his family obviously moves to California. His father joins the California National Guard as a soldier there for a while. And obviously growing up with these stories of, his grandfather's service in the Civil War, I'm sure his dad also talked about serving in the California National Guard. That leaves a young George Patton who is impressionable with this idea that he wants to be a soldier too. Like many people who are drawn to the colors, right? This is how many soldiers start their story, is listening to their father or grandfather share their military stories. I think what's more important for Patton's career concerning his family is the wealth and connections that his father brings, right? So his father is a very wealthy and prominent LA lawyer. He becomes mayor of San Marino. He runs for Congress a couple of times. And these connections is what really allows Patton to both start his educational career, first at VMI and then later at the U.S. Military Academy, but it also allows him to influence where he's stationed after Fort Sheridan, for example. It allows him to host these extravagant parties with people like Henry Stimson and just really excel as a socialite. This is what I believe is the most important factor of Patton's upbringing, is this social sort of acumen that his father instills within George Patton.
Yeah, and I didn't really think about it until you just mentioned it, like hearing these stories, these war stories from your grandfather or your father. And there is this interesting part in the movie Patton and I. The British generals are meeting with Patton, and one of them says, "Oh, George, I think you would have been a great marshal for Napoleon if you were there." And Patton was like, "I was there." And allegedly, he believed that he lived past lives. Where did that belief come from?
He very well could have. I tend to lean more towards the camp of all his writings where he references being, some soldier in the past. I tend to believe that stems more from his being well versed in military history from a very young age. He was read these military history stories. Then once he was able to read, he dived into this literature. And so I feel that him being able to go to like France during the First World War, for instance, and seeing Roman ruins, that he's able to draw on these historical connections and feels very passionately about it as I was there. But it's not him physically being there. It's this metaphorical I as a soldier was there, or soldiers in the past were there. Not
Right.
necessarily, he is, Napoleon's Marshall's reincarnate. It's actually really hard to tell what he truly believed when all we have to go off of is a handful of poetry and some secondhand accounts.
Yeah, he has an interesting upbringing. At the age of 18, he seeks appointment at West Point U.S. Military Academy. And it's been said that he struggled with dyslexia, and that kind of impacted his academics. Is that accurate?
It might be. It's really hard to tell. So Stanley Hirschon, for example, he argues that Patton didn't have dyslexia, and that he only struggled with spelling. And it's important to point out that Patton was homeschooled until like the age of 11, and his father had some very peculiar ideas about how a student should learn. And basically, Patton did not read until he went to an actual public school. Things were read to him, and as such, he was behind. He had to catch up to the rest of his age cohort when it came to reading, writing, that sort of thing. Clearly, he didn't have dyslexia, according to Stanley Hirschon, because he looked at Patton's report cards from whenever he went to grade school, and he excelled at math. He excelled at reading. The only thing that he seems to have struggled with is spelling, which, as someone who struggles to spell now and isn't dyslexic, that's not necessarily a sign. But ultimately, right, even if he had dyslexia, he managed to overcome it, with the exception of his spelling, because that never seems to improve in his letters. But it is
Yeah.
what it is. But
Yeah.
he's able to overcome that and achieve the things that he wants to achieve.
Yeah. It seems he did fine at West Point and graduated.
Well, he had some initial struggles after he transfers from VMI and he goes to West Point. He fails out his pleb year, but Stanley Hirschon argues that has more to do with Patton's hyper focus on achieving top marks and like drill and ceremony, where he may have prioritized that over academics a little too much.
Yeah, that's an interesting point as well. Yeah, we'll come back to that. And I think most people don't know this, but Patton was an Olympic athlete competing in the 1912 games in Stockholm. How did Patton's participation in the Olympics pentathlon reflect his drive for physical excellence and competitiveness?
Well, that's a really interesting question. So Patton lived a very active lifestyle from a very young age till practically his death. He spent his childhood horseback riding, shooting, playing all these war games. Whenever he got into the U.S. Military Academy, West Point, he started fencing and was surprisingly good at that. He ran track and field for West Point. He played football, although not the greatest at it. He did play. Once he graduated, he continued to stay active, played football for the Army team at Fort Sheridan. And in May 1912, he's selected to represent the United States at the Stockholm Olympics in the modern pentathlon. And he gets like a month of preparation time. He's told, basically a month before the Olympics that, hey, you're going to represent the United States. So he starts training immediately. He trains on the boat ride over to Sweden. And when he gets there, the first event, he flubs it, right? It's the 25 meter pistol shoot. And Patton, that's the only event that he didn't practice because he just thought he had it in the bag. Well, he placed 21st in the pistol shooting. He blamed it on his nerves. He didn't practice. So I think we can all agree that that's probably what got him. But the other events he did phenomenally. The 300-meter swim, he placed 7th overall. Fencing, he placed 5th. He defeated some very well-respected fencers during this event. The 3-mile riding steeplechase, he placed 3rd. And then he placed 3rd in the 2.5-mile run. And ultimately, he placed 5th in the whole event.
Yeah, 5th overall.
Which is very impressive, much better than I could do, that's for sure.
Well, and as you mentioned, with limited training.
A month.
Right, yeah. So that's all very impressive. And then, did he also invent a saber or design a new saber?
He did design a new saber right after the Olympics, the model 1913 cavalry saber. It's where a normal cavalry saber is, curved, almost scimitar-looking thing. His saber is very straight, almost like a fencing sword. And he went to the mat. People were criticizing him and his design, but he wrote all sorts of articles and periodicals about how, a cavalryman should strike with the point of his sword and not slash and all of this. But ultimately, it's kind of a moot point, right? Because we're entering the era of aircraft and modern artillery, machine guns, automobiles. But he vehemently defended this sword that ultimately doesn't really get used.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting. Maybe he was in Napoleon's cavalry, he's designing sabers, but then he also is very forward thinking, which we'll come to in a minute with tanks and tank tactics and all that kind of stuff. So it's really unique to have a guy who's so steeped in tradition, but can also think progressively on what's coming next. Well, let's discuss his personal life real quick. At the age of 24, he marries Beatrice Eyre. How was their marriage, and did they have kids, or how was this particular marriage?
So Patton actually met his future wife in 1902. Whenever he was 17, she was 16. Her family was very wealthy and had vacationed out in California near Patton's house. They start seeing each other about 1905, around the time that Patton starts West Point. Sort of this on again, off again romance. Maybe they're dating, maybe they're not. It's very unclear. In 1908, Patton has a fling with this woman named Kate Fuller, and he romances both her and Beatrice at the same time, and it's a real conundrum for him. He writes his father about who does he choose. But ultimately, he ends up picking Beatrice, and they're married or he proposes to her in December 1908. They're married in May 1910. To Patton's credit, he did not hide Kate's existence from his wife. They were actually good friends of the Pattons. Kate and her future husband were good friends until Patton's death. Ultimately, Patton and Bea had 3 children. And this is a running trend in the Patton family, is they are unoriginal with names, but they have Bea Jr., who's their first daughter, their second daughter, Ruth Ellen, which is named after another member of the Patton family, and then their son, George S. Patton IV, which doesn't get confusing at all because you have George Patton Jr. and George Patton IV.
Right.
But the Patton family is weird like that. As far as the way their marriage was, it seems for the most part pretty well. He wrote to her all the time. They seem to have a generally decent relationship until Patton gets assigned to Hawaii in the 1930s. He seems to have started an affair with his niece by marriage, Jean Gordon, and this affair kind of props back up during World War II. It's really hard to say if it was an affair. The Patton family certainly believed it was an affair, but there's many historians who kind of disagree about the nature of their relationship.
Interesting. Yeah, I didn't know all that.
Now, it is important to point out that Beatrice comes from one of the wealthiest families in the United States, and Patton does use the money and connections that his wife brings to further his career, because he hosts all sorts of people at his various residences.
And that's a great point. Like, maybe he doesn't need to worry about money because he's set for life now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Basically.
Well, let's discuss his World War I service. During World War I, he serves as a lieutenant in the Pancho Villa expedition in 1915 under General Blackjack Pershing. What do you think Patton learned in these early days?
So I think one of the key points that he learns is, again, his connections gets him where he wants. So Patton gets assigned to Fort Bliss in 1915, and his sister Nita visits Patton at Fort Bliss, and she meets Blackjack Pershing, and the two start a relationship. Right, Pershing's wife and children died in a fire very recently, and Nita and Pershing start this relationship. They become engaged in 1917, and it doesn't really go anywhere, and they split up in 1919. But most importantly, when Pancho Villa raids Columbus in March 1916, Patton is terrified that his unit's not going to be deployed to Mexico. And he begs and begs and begs Pershing to bring him along, and Pershing does. Now, it seems likely to me that Pershing brings Patton along as a favor to his sister, but again, this is just a speculation. Now, once he's actually in Mexico, I think some of the big lessons that Patton takes away is, obviously, this is why he carries 2 pistols, right? He gets in this gunfight and he runs out of ammo, so he pledges to always carry 2 pistols so that he doesn't have to reload. But I think what's more important is Patton is extremely bored in Mexico. They're driving around, not really accomplishing anything, and this frustrates Patton. So after the war in Mexico, he starts thinking, how do we use like automobiles? How do we use cavalry in a sensible way in the 20th century, right? And so this plants the seeds of his sort of aggressive nature, where he's going to find the enemy wherever they are, right? His famous motto of grab the enemy by the nose and kick him in the ass. This is where the inklings of that begins.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point for my next question. The kind of idea of mechanized, whether it's cavalry or infantry or whatever, just get your troops there the fastest. In 1917, Patton is promoted to captain and becomes Pershing's personal aide. In what ways did Patton's experience pioneering American tank warfare in World War I foreshadow his aggressive armored tactics in World War II?
So yeah, Pershing brings Patton along to France as part of the AEF. They get into Europe in June 1917. Patton doesn't stay on Pershing's staff very long. In November 1917, he says, "Hey, they're propping up this new tank corps thing. I'm going to throw my lot in with them." And he goes and attends this French light tank training center. After he completed that, he started writing on tank doctrine. He envisioned tanks as this tool to smash through enemy defenses in support of infantry, and to use these tanks after they smash through to pursue any retreating infantry, very much in the same way you would utilize cavalry during like the Napoleonic era, for example. He finishes the tank training center, the French tank training center. He props up an American tank training center, and he spends a lot of time training tankers without any tanks. It's actually pretty phenomenal what he's able to accomplish, because once they get the tanks, they're already well trained. They already understand how they're going to use them, and it's just simply learning how to actually drive these machines. So they're not wasting a bunch of time doing stuff that they needed the tanks for it anyway. So Patton goes into action the first time September 1918. He really distinguishes himself as a commander during his first battle, which is part of the Battle of San Miguel. He puts himself in direct line of danger against General Samuel Rockenbach's direct order. He orders that battalion and brigade commanders have to stay behind the rear.
Wait, you're saying Patton didn't follow orders?
Oh yeah, who would have thought?
I can't believe it.
So he goes to the line with his tankers. He observes what tank warfare actually is. He's there with his men. As we'll talk about later, there's many things that you can say bad about Patton, but you can't say that he's a coward. He puts himself in the line of danger, and he tries his best to help his men when, the rubber meets the road. But during his first battle, right, he sees that his tanks are running into difficulty. They're getting stuck in the mud. They're getting, running out of fuel, this sort of things. And he internalizes these lessons, right? So he goes back and he continues to train his men. And moving on into the second battle he participates in, he requires that his tanks carry jerry cans of fuel. He listened to one of his privates who recommended that they have a tank on standby ready to salvage and repair vehicles, either to get them operational in the field as quickly as possible, or to pull them to the rear and get them fixed and back into service quicker than would have otherwise happened. And this is really interesting because this is a sort of operational procedure that continues on in World War II. This is extensively used with recovery vehicles. But ultimately, Patton is wounded in his second battle, which is part of the Meuse-Argonne campaign. He's shot in the leg, and this is basically the end of his First World War. He stays in Europe for occupation duties, but he doesn't get involved in combat anymore.
Okay. Yeah, and I think it's interesting that World War I was kind of a static war. There's trenches and there wasn't a lot of movement. But Patton kind of realized that the next war isn't going to be like that. There's going to be a lot of mechanized tanks moving.
It's important to remember, too, by the time Patton goes into an actual combat action in September 1918, the nature of World War I had really changed. Towards the end of World War I, we start seeing a lot more combined arms and a war of movement start to develop. Nothing like what happens in World War II, but the seeds of that are there. And Patton's, to his credit, is clearly able to look at that and say, I need to focus on this. I need to play around with this. I need to figure it out.
So by now, he's kind of getting his military philosophy in place. How did he embrace the philosophy of a relentless offense? And does this contrast with the more cautious Allied commanders?
Well, I think Patton's ideas of how you fight war stems from him being a cavalry commander, right? In cavalry, sort of doctrine at this time, aggression is prioritized. So we kind of talked about it before. So after Mexico, Patton, he's bored. He realizes that his forces need to pursue the enemy wherever they are. During World War I, he starts thinking about how he can use tanks like the Napoleonic heavy cavalry, right? How do you use tanks to break through the enemy's defenses? How do you use tanks to pursue and cut down the enemy as they retreat? After World War I, though, he downplays the role of tanks in his writing. We have to remember that Patton is a cavalry commander, and during the interwar period, tanks are part of the infantry arm. And when peacetime army starts, budget cuts and downsizing, Patton doesn't want his beloved cavalry branch to be, a victim of that. So he starts downplaying the role of tanks. But ultimately, some army maneuvers in 1940s brings him back around on the idea of tanks, and he signs on to some recommendations that go through, which is to combine cavalry and infantry tank units into 4 armor divisions, right? 1, 2, 3, and 4th armor division. And that really sets Patton on the path to this sort of fame and glory that we know him for in World War II, because he becomes, the commanding general of 2nd Armored Division shortly thereafter.
Yeah, let's discuss his interwar years between 1919 and 1939. What's he doing during this time? I know he returns home in 1919. And I also know he was involved in MacArthur's removal of the bonus army in 1932, which he wasn't very pleased to be a part of. Can you kind of touch on that?
So, of course, he manages to survive the sort of immediate post war budget cuts and downsizing. He spends some time at Camp Meade, Maryland, where he and Eisenhower, in a bit of foreshadowing, they spend a lot of time taking tanks apart, learning how they work. They start playing around with ideas of how to use tanks. And of course, he's entertaining and socializing with all the influential people in the Washington, D.C. area, as he's known to. He attends the War College in 1931-32, graduates relatively well, and then he's assigned thereafter to Fort Myers, Virginia, which leads us into the sort of bonus army thing. So when the bonus army protest starts, Patton is furious. He sees them as these like revolutionaries. He doesn't understand why soldiers behave this way, but it's also important to remember that Patton is exceptionally wealthy, so it's no surprise that he would view people in this way. Anyways, on July 28th, 1932, MacArthur is told to, hey, go in, we need to quell this protest. And Patton and his 3rd Cavalry Regiment, armed with tanks, are sent in to help. This gets real violent real fast, but we don't need to get into the specifics. But I think an interesting tidbit that comes out of this is the day after the bonus army protest is crushed, one of the bonus army marchers, a man by the name of Joe Angelo, approaches Patton's camp to talk to him. Well, it's interesting because when Patton was shot during the Battle of the Meuse-Argonne campaign, it was Joe Angelo that pulled him into the foxhole or into the shell hole and saved his life. Patton recognizes this and he sends Joe Angelo away. He says, I won't have a conversation with you. And Patton's very conscious of the role of media. Patton's afraid that if he's seen, conversing with this bonus army man who had saved his life, that it's going to just blow the lid off the whole thing, right? It's very indicative of, again, Patton's sort of acumen for social and media roles in his life and the way that these things can help his career or hurt his career.
Yeah, the whole thing is weird. This because he is a World War One veteran. Here are these other veterans who are promised a bonus. They're protesting, so he basically has to remove his old comrades from DC violently in some ways.
Well,
And
you have to remember too. It's not what the sense I get from reading Patton is. It's not so much he understands. Oh, these are fellow soldiers, which he develops that later on, especially during World War II. But at this point, right, Patton is still sort of the upper crust of society, and this is old 19th century style upper crust. So he's a product of wealthy people who made their living during the Gilded Age. So he still has these views of, oh well, they're poor, they're downtrodden because they lack, they have some sort of character flaw in them. That's why they're like this, or they're revolutionaries, they're socialist revolutionaries, that sort of thing. So Patton has less sympathy for them than someone else might have, like Eisenhower, for example, who was also involved in this.
yeah. Well, let's discuss World War II. We have a lot to get to in his story. I want to talk about his discipline and image. I mean, have been talking about his image. He's always concerned about it. What is his rank at this point, and where is he?
So when World War II starts, Patton is a major general. He is at Fort Benning. He is the commander of 2nd Armored Division. So he goes off after Pearl Harbor happens. Germany declares war on the United States 11th December 1941. Patton recognizes, or the U.S. Army as a whole recognizes, that the fighting is going to be in the deserts of North Africa first. That's where we're going to take the fight to the Germans. So Patton is sent over to California. He establishes a desert training center where he runs his men ragged out in the desert. He has this idea that many a commander, much to my former lower enlisted chagrin, is the idea of hard maneuvers means an easy war, right? You lose sweat to save blood.
Yep.
Which it does well for him in North Africa. Whenever Operation Torch starts, he's commander of the Western Task Force. They have a relatively easy invasion of Morocco. They encounter some token French resistance, but Patton just rolls over them. Now, after the Battle of the Kasserine Pass, which, as we all know, is this disaster, and Friedenau is relieved of command, Patton takes over command of 2 Corps. And when he gets to his command, he recognizes the problem, or at least in his head, is this lack of discipline. These troops lack discipline, and this is why they lost. So he really cracks down. And, again, my former enlisted heart, he gets really draconian, right? He makes his men wear helmets at all times, which is acceptable, but he wants them to wear their leggings, their gaiters at all times, wear neckties out in the desert, this sort of thing. And if they don't, he fines them.
I guess it comes back to, dress professional, be professional. Like, you look at his image. He had the ivory handled pistols and the polished uniforms, and he always looked sharp all the time. And I don't have enough time in this hour long podcast to discuss Friedenhall's incompetence, but I think, like you were saying, train hard in practice, and then when we get to the game, which is the battle, we'll perform well. And I guess that's what his discipline thoughts were.
It could be. It's not really clear exactly what his thought process around it was, other than I want my soldiers to be disciplined, and this is how I instill that sense of discipline in my soldiers.
Right. Well, let's discuss Sicily and some rivalries now. How did Patton's race across Sicily and rivalry with British General Montgomery highlight both his brilliance and his flaws?
Okay, so Patton assumes command of 7th Army. 7th Army is created in anticipation of Operation Husky. It's really interesting to point out that this is Patton's first command of the Army. This is his first time trying to manage infantry, armor, airborne units, everything in between. So the plan for Operation Husky is for Patton's 7th Army to land at Gela, Scaglietti, and Licata, and to cover Montgomery's 8th Army that were landing east near Syracuse. The plan called for the British 8th Army to march up the eastern edge of Sicily and capture Messina, whereas Patton was just going to basically cover the western flank of Monty's 8th Army, which Patton isn't really happy with, but he is a soldier and he agrees, hey, I'll do what I'm told, right? Well, Monty's forces get pinned down, and Alexander, the Supreme Commander of the invasion of Sicily, he gives Patton the green light to go ahead and take Palermo. So Patton does this brilliant move that kind of foreshadows what he does later on in the Bulge, and he takes the 3rd Infantry Division and he marches them across 100 miles or so of just absolutely horrible terrain. And in 3 days, he captures Palermo on the 21st of July. And then after taking Palermo, he sets his sights on Messina and starts driving towards Messina. During this, he launches 3 amphibious landings, I believe, on the 8th, the 10th, and the 16th of August. There's obviously some debate over the value of these, but I'm of the opinion that Patton understood that future Allied operations, such as the invasion of Italy, and then later on, Overlord and Dragoon, were going to involve amphibious operations, and he wanted to make sure that as many troops as he possibly could got experience with actually doing a amphibious operation in combat. But ultimately, we don't really know if that's what he thought, but it worked. So these landings are very small. They're only regimental size against relatively token resistance. And of course, the last of these amphibious operations begin on 16 August 1943, which is the same day that Patton takes Messina. Famously, as the movie showed, it didn't happen quite like the movie, but he got there a few hours before Montgomery did. There's also this criticism of Patton and Montgomery both allowing the Germans to evacuate tons of manpower and material across the Strait of Messina into the boot of Italy. I don't think that you could fault either one of them for that. Any sort of operation where you're going to withdraw troops like that, I don't think you could stop it.
I mean, it's been documented. There was a rivalry between Montgomery and Patton, but they're both prideful guys with egos. Same thing in, Napoleon's marshals all had egos. These are important guys who have thousands of men at their control. So, and it's something that comes up again with Patton. There's a rivalry there between him and other generals.
There is a rivalry there, but I don't get the sense it's like they're going to sabotage each other to achieve glory. It's more of a friendly competition, right? Like Patton gets heated, of course. That's just his personality. But he's never at any step trying to snub his quote-unquote competitors.
Yeah. Yeah, and I've read, as tough as it was to serve under Patton, he didn't sack commanders as often as, say, Bradley did. Bradley sacked more commanders than Patton did. He just wanted discipline from everyone that worked under him. Well, let's talk about some of the controversial incidents, because we all know the famous slapping incidents, and there's another one that I want to talk about that nearly derailed his career, the Biscari massacre. I know you've done some research on that.
Yes.
Can you kind of dive into these? What happens here? Is he just out of control and thinks he can do whatever he wants, or is he just generally upset with shell-shocked soldiers?
Well, I think we all kind of know the big picture part of the slapping, right? So on August 3rd and August 10th, he visits a hospital. There's some soldiers who are recovering from shell shock, and he he flies off the handle and slaps these guys around, calls them cowards, everything in between. This forces Ike to relieve him of command of 7th Army. First, Ike has to handle it himself. He tells Patton to go and apologize to everyone involved, which he does. Then word gets out back in the States, even though they tried to suppress it. And then Ike is kind of put in this position where he ends up having to relieve Patton of 7th Army. But I don't think, and this is based on my own research, I'm not convinced that the slapping is what Patton was relieved of command of 7th Army for. I believe Patton was probably relieved of 7th Army because of his mouth and his maybe not influencing soldiers to kill prisoners of war. So obviously, we're all aware of the way Patton speaks, right? So before Operation Torch, he talks to members of 9th Infantry Division, tells them that we'll rape their women and we'll pillage their towns. This sort of talk is not what a general should be telling his men to do. And then before Operation Husky on 27 June 1943, Patton gives 2 addresses to members of the 45th Infantry Division. It's important to point out the 45th Infantry Division is a division of the Oklahoma National Guard. Patton is concerned that they're not going to be aggressive enough. This is his first time leading National Guardsmen, and he gives these rousing speeches where his mouth goes ahead faster than his brain, and he basically insinuates that they shouldn't take prisoners of war. Talks about how if, the prisoner of war is just somebody who tried to kill you but failed, all of this. Well, on 14 June 1943, elements of the 180th Infantry Regiment of the 45th Infantry Division, across 2 separate incidents, they murder more than 70 Italian and German prisoners of war, and these are very clearly murders. They're deliberate acts. 2 incidents, the West incident, the Compton incident, they bring 2 soldiers to trial for this. One of the perpetrators, a guy named Sergeant Horace West, he's found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment for this, whereas the other soldier who's brought to trial, Captain John Compton of C Company, 180th, he's acquitted of charges. And the reason he's acquitted is because he says, hey, Patton told us not to take prisoners. And, when a major general tells me to do something, I say, yes, sir, and I do it. Well, that causes problems, right? Because they've convicted a sergeant for that. Well, what happens is that the sergeant's brother, the sergeant was given life imprisonment, he starts writing to a senator saying, hey, it's my brother, what happened here? Well, the War Department catches wind of it, and they launch an IG investigation in March 1944, where they go to England and they interview Patton and Middleton and some other key players that were in the 45th Infantry Division and 7th Army, and they basically conclude that, yeah, Patton probably inspired that guy. He probably didn't mean it, but he did inspire that guy. They end up letting West, they release him from prison. He goes back to service. He's reduced to a private, serves in the 100th Infantry Division until the end of the war. Compton's killed in Italy very soon after his trial. Based on what I've seen, it seems likely that Ike relieved Patton of command of 7th Army because of the Sicily incident. And they used the slapping incidents as a convenient cover so they didn't have to admit that American troops were basically committing war crimes. Relatively consistent with what we see during World War II, right? Where these West Point graduates, they cover for themselves. This is exactly what Harry Truman is so upset about during World War II. He's a National Guard officer, and he saw during World War I this sort of good old boy system that exists. Well, right. Here's a good example of this in action. Like, even if we follow the traditional story where Ike initially tries to cover up the slapping incidents, it's clear that, to me anyways, that this is why Patton's relieved.
Well, even the slapping incidents, like Patton loved the cameras and the press, and he liked having his name written up in the papers. And he invited the press to come with him in those hospitals. So I think he just didn't realize the double-edged sword that is the press. Yeah, they'll write great things about you when you're winning battles, but if you slapping patients in a hospital, that's not a good look.
Well, it's clear that he was a very impulsive person, be that a good thing or bad thing for a military commander. He was impulsive, and it seems that, especially in the slapping incidents, he just kind of let his emotions get the better of him, trying to play devil's advocate. Right? It's his first command of an army. He's trying to coordinate these massive sweeping movements across one of the largest islands in the world. He's probably under a lot of stress, not sleeping well, and he sees this thing that angers him, and he just flies off the handle.
Yeah, it's just very interesting on that part. Let's discuss the Battle of Bulge, which is maybe his most famous maneuver. After notably playing the role of decoy in command of a ghost army during the D-Day invasion, Eisenhower puts Patton back into the field in August 1944. Later that year in December, Hitler makes a last gamble in the surprise attack known as the Battle of the Bulge. What made Patton's rapid pivot of Third Army during the battle one of the most remarkable feats of World War II maneuver warfare?
So it's important to realize that, Patton had just taken Metz in November 1944. There was still some sporadic resistance in the city well into December. Elements of his Third Army were pushing into the Saar Valley in early December 1944. So Patton has, some forces in Germany at the time. 16 December 1944, Germany begins the Battle of the Bulge. Obviously, elements of the 9th and 10th Armored and the entire 101st Airborne are encircled in Bastogne. December 19th, Ike calls a meeting of Allied commanders in Verdun. Patton, before he leaves off, he says, he talks to his staff and he says, hey, I need some contingency plans because I have a sense of what's coming. Start working on plans now. So Patton gets to this meeting in Verdun. They discuss the situation. And Ike asks Patton, how soon can you get forces there? And, Patton famously turns and says, give me 2 days. Ike says, that's not possible. I'll give you 3. And he tells Patton that, he wants to start the attack on 22 December. What's interesting about this is Patton wasn't lying when he said 2 days, right? So because he had his staff start planning immediately, and I think this speaks more to Patton's staff than it necessarily does Patton, although Patton certainly deserves credit for trusting his staff. But his staff comes up with a brilliant plan in a very short time. So Patton is able to pivot the 4th Armored, 26th Infantry, and 80th Infantry Divisions 90 degrees from their assault. He stops their assault into Germany, turns them 90 degrees, and rushes them north. He also brings his 3rd and his 7th Corps and repositions them on a whole broad east-west front. He rushes them over hundreds of miles across poor roads, just dense forest, winter weather, everything in between. And he gets there with his troops intact, their fuel, their food, and when he arrives on 26 December, they're combat ready. They're not broken down from the march. They're there ready to fight, and they save the 101st Airborne.
Yeah, and the secret of logistics is evident right there. And I do like that you discussed it's incredibly hard. If
Yes.
all of your troops are facing east, to turn them 90 degrees to go north, and it's hundreds of thousands of troops.
While he's also trying to maintain some forces on an eastern posture to make sure he doesn't lose what they've already taken. It's frankly brilliant. And Patton, his staff, even down to the average private, they all deserve credit for making this thing happen. This is an amazing feat. It's hard to really appreciate how amazing Patton's 90-degree pivot north actually is, because just talking about it's like, oh yep, he turned and he got there and he had all of his stuff, but that's no easy feat, especially in December 1944, one of the worst winters on record, with an army that's already outstretching its supplies.
But then there's that famous quote from the Airborne Division that they didn't need saving.
Well, it seems obvious to me that they needed some saving. Maybe they could have fought it out, but having tanks there to help them certainly was no detriment to the Allied war effort.
Yep, agreed. Okay, let's talk about Patton's post-war vision. The war in Europe ends in May 1945. Patton has some outspoken warnings about the Soviet Union. How did this strain his relationship with the U.S. leadership?
So Patton is obviously very critical of the Soviet Union. He gets in some trouble whenever he's in England after getting relieved the command of 7th Army, where he basically says, again, the movie does a really good job of highlighting this, where he basically says that the United Kingdom and the United States are destined to rule the world, and he kind of snubs the Soviets. But after Germany's defeat, after VE Day, Patton's put in charge. He's the military governor of Bavaria. And, his sort of anti-Soviet leanings really bleeds through with his reluctance to denazify Bavaria after this time, right? So on the face of it, he protests that, civil servants need training, and that the only trained people that are available to him in the immediate, the here and now, are former Nazi officials. He basically insinuates that, if you can find me some trained civil servants who aren't Nazis, I'll gladly put them in, but there are none. And he also, he goes and compares again, the movie does a really good job of kind of showing this. He kind of insinuates that the Nazi Party's a political party no different from the Democrats and Republicans, and gets him in trouble again. I think what's more interesting, beyond just his sort of reluctance to denazify, or even his sort of distrust of the Soviets, which, mind you, it's not just a Patton thing at this time. Most Western leaders are distrustful of the Soviets, but it's a very tense political situation. They had just ended a world war. Nobody wants to start another one. except Patton, clearly. His reluctance to denazify Germany, his comments on displaced persons, and his very vocal anti-Soviet sentiments is what gets him relieved of Third Army. He's removed from the governorship of Bavaria, and he's given command of the 15th Army, which is like a group of basically military historians who are tasked to write a history of the war, which Patton seems like the guy that you'd want there. He loves military history, well read, but he gets bored of it, and so he tours Europe, he goes hunting and all of this, and that sort of ultimately leads to his downfall.
Yeah, let's talk about that. In December 1945, Patton is involved in a car accident and becomes paralyzed from the neck down. He dies a few weeks later. Can you tell us what happened here?
So yeah, like I was mentioning, once Patton gets command of 15th Army, he gets bored and he goes hunting and traveling across Europe. So on 9 December 1945, Patton and Hap Gay were traveling on the Autobahn in their Cadillac. They were driven by a private first class. They were going hunting near Mannheim when a T5 named Robert Thompson, he swerves, something happens, and his quarter-ton truck collides into Patton's Cadillac. The car goes off the road, tumbles, throws all of them out. Gay and the driver, private first class Woodring, they have minor injuries, but Patton is seriously wounded. He has a broken neck. He's paralyzed from the neck down. He famously asked Hap Gay to work his fingers, and so Gay plays around with Patton's fingers, and that's when Patton realizes, I'm paralyzed. I can't feel anything. They scoop him up, take him to the hospital. His wife, Beatrice, she arrives on 11 December, and during this period, when Patton's able to, he dictates his autobiography to his wife as best he could. Obviously, he suffered a very traumatic injury. He's put in spinal traction. Yeah. I can only imagine how painful it was for him in his final days. On the 21st of December, 1945, doctors prepare him for transfer to the United States. The powers that be are insistent that Patton does not die in Germany, and so they put him in a full body cast. They're planning to send him back to the United States, but ultimately, it seems that this preparation is what puts a lot of strain on Patton's body, and he succumbs later that evening at like 6 p.m., I believe. And he's ultimately buried in Luxembourg on Christmas Eve, 1945. But his wife was very insistent that he would want to be married next to the fallen of Third Army. So he's buried in Luxembourg with Third Army soldiers who were killed during the Battle of the Bulge, which is a fitting end for him, I think.
Yeah, for sure. Well, let's talk about his legacy. What does his life teach us about the balance between brilliance and controversy in military leadership?
Well, very clearly, for all his faults, Patton was a very gifted commander, right? He was very well read. He was a good soldier. But when you get to the level of being, a lieutenant and full general, being good on the battlefield only takes you so far. At that level, you also have to be cordial. You have to be a statesman, and Patton clearly was not a statesman. And so it's important, I guess, the big takeaway is when we're training junior officers and mid-level officers, we need to train them to think not just about the military consequences of their actions, but they also need to start considering the political sphere. And that's even more important in today's age where we're not necessarily getting in these all-out kinetic wars. We're fighting these, if you subscribe to the term, these fifth-generation wars, right, where the enemy is less clear and that the consequences are much longer. This political realm of warfare is increasingly more important. And so looking at Patton as this icon that we should hold all of our officers up to may not hold up in the 21st century.
Yeah, and I think that's even a criticism of Napoleon. Like, he was a great general, but was he a very good diplomat? I mean, his record was mixed, and he didn't always say the right things, kind of like Patton.
Yeah, and having people who can produce results on the battlefield is important, but you also have to be sure that after the fighting's over, those people know how to behave and how to act. And clearly, Patton didn't.
Yeah.
Or rather, he knew how to act and just didn't care. The jury's out on that.
But there's something to the hero worship, the old blood and guts. Like, the guy was always leading from the front, like in the movie.
And that's a good quality for officers, right? Patton was seen by his men, not just on the front, but just in training, right? Patton was seen. And as a former enlisted man myself, it's important. Even if, the senior officer has much better ways to spend their time, that few extra moments that Patton took or any other commander emulating that style takes to just be there with his men, to say like, yep, we're all here enduring this together. I'm here with you. It goes a lot. And we can see in Third Army, right? Patton's men in Third Army are willing to do seemingly impossible tasks because they know Patton asked them, and that Patton wouldn't ask them to do anything that he wouldn't be willing to do himself.
But yeah, Patton is such a unique character, and I really appreciate the biography on him. That was great,
Well,
Nathaniel.
I appreciate you having me on.
Yeah. Again, Nathaniel Marshall, graduate student, University of North Texas, and love to have you on again, my friend.
Love to be on.
Yeah. As always, please check out our other podcast, Generals and Napoleon, and we will be back. Thanks for listening.